Hey, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. This is episode 168, and we're looking at the middle class crisis and what you can do about it.
Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast on all the heavy-hitting topics at the moment, aren't we? We had some pretty heavy-duty economics last week, and this week we've thrown the word crisis in there. We're kind of taking a bit of a journalistic lead there, but we're talking about the middle-class crisis and, importantly, what you can do about it. We covered it in the magazine a few months back, but we're going to get into it in even more detail today. And of course, we're going to relate it all back to property and what property's got to do with it and how property can help you related to this topic, because that is, of course, why we're all here. So that's coming up, as well as a really good resource and an interesting news story. First, though, just a quick mention that today is Meetup Day. It's the first Thursday of the month, which means, of course, it is the Property Hub meetups. 30 of them, more than 30, I think, around the country tonight. Also, as far afield as Copenhagen, we had Dubai last night. I can barely keep up with where they all are. They're just mushering up all over the place. But wherever you are, just go to thepropertyhub.net/meetups, find your nearest, register for it. We can pretty much guarantee, you're going to have a great time.
We can. And talking about them popping up everywhere, Rob, I'm going to be at a new meetup for the first time. It's launching tonight in Maidstone. So if anybody is in the Maidstone area and you're listening to this on the day of the recording, head that way, jump on the propertyhub.net/meetups, find your closest meetup. If you're nowhere near Maidstone, don't worry, there's plenty of others. So check it out that list, get along, completely free, completely laid back, and a lot of fun.
Okay, let's talk about our news story this week. And this week, one that I found, it's a survey/press release thingy put out by Direct Line for Business. And it's to do with average lengths of tenancy around the country and how long it takes to find a tenant. And it's really interesting because from running a letting agency, we've seen that you get some tenancies which turn over all the time. Tenants always seem to be on the move, and others where people will stay in situ for years and years. The interesting thing is that the average, apparently, across the UK is 18 months. And I was actually surprised by how short that is, because, well, yes, we know that you'll get sort of city centre locations with young professionals who want to be very mobile and be moving all the time to either move in with someone different or to move for work or whatever. But I assume that there'd be lots of people balancing it out at the other end of the scale, staying for a really long time and pulling that average up. I thought 18 months is actually very short. The question, I suppose, from that is, are they staying for such a short length of time because they want to move? Or is it because there's some negative factor, like they get kicked out or the rent gets put up or the property's horrible? I suppose that's what this survey doesn't show, but it does show how it varies around the country, and also how in different parts of the country it can take very different amounts of time to actually fill a property that's empty.
Yeah, there's some really interesting data here. So you'd expect that, well, I would have anyway, that London properties rent the fastest, but not the case. Have a few guesses in your head, but the answer is Birmingham. It takes only 11 days for a property in Birmingham to be let. Which, interestingly enough, Birmingham is also the place where tenants like to stay the longest. So they will stay on average for 2 years and 4 months. However, for those investors interested in Cardiff, you'll be pleased to know that it only takes 2 weeks to let your property, but you're going to need to let it quick because tenants tend to leave on average every 11 months, so not even a year. So really good data. I don't know how much of a sample they've used, but it's interesting nevertheless, and you'll find this in the show notes this week, which is at thepropertyhub.net/middle class.
Okay, let's get on to our topic of the week then, the middle class crisis and what you can do about it. Like I said at the beginning, we explored this in our magazine cover story a while back, but we wanted to get into it in more detail today. And it also sets us up perfectly to talk about house prices next week. So we'll be talking more about what's coming up next week at the end. So this week, we're going to see some of the causes for what we're going to talk about next week, as well as the real life consequences. And what we're going to talk about kind of shows that the economics that we talked about last week isn't just dry theory. It impacts everybody, some of them in a good way and some not in such a good way. So to start exploring this topic, we should really define what it is that we're talking about. what is the middle class? Rob, you once said that I was proper middle class because I was talking about the Archers on Radio 4, and you were pretend middle class because you had no idea what I was talking about. That's one definition, but what's the real definition?
Well, the Cambridge Dictionary defines the middle class as a social group that consists of well-educated people who have a good job and are neither very rich or very poor. So that's the dictionary, and it kind of makes sense. It's a nice summary. It's people who are just doing well. They're not stressed by money, but they haven't got loads of it either. They're just in a good place financially. Now, in the UK particularly, class has been a bit of an obsession. People talk about it. People are very proud of their class marker wherever they are in all three categories, working class, middle class, upper class. Wherever you sat, people tend to be very proud of where the position was and what it represented. But more and more people were going in to the middle class section. That was the case. And you could argue that's a good thing because of the description we gave earlier. People were neither very rich or very poor. And we had this nation where so many people would identify themselves as middle class. But the whole crisis and the reason behind today's episode is that's being squeezed. Middle classes, as we know it, are reducing. Some are moving up in terms of wealth, and they're going into the ultra-wealthy section. But actually, the majority are going down into working class. Now, they may not see themselves as working class, but if by definition of wealth, they are. And this is what we're going to look at in today's episode, because it's a crisis that's happening, a bit like the pension crisis, where people can't see it's happening, even though it's right under their noses.
Yeah, so when we're talking about middle class, for the purposes of this episode, we're kind of talking about middle income. We're not talking about how you pronounce scone or scone. We're talking about kind of income levels. Like, are people really struggling? Are they very well off? Or are they somewhere in the middle? And it's the people in the middle who are kind of comfortably well off, having decent jobs and making reasonable money, having a good standard of living, who are disappearing, according to several data points. So Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, was quoted saying that living standards have been squeezed for longer than at any time in living memory. And you could go further than that. There's evidence that middle classes aren't just being squeezed, they're vanishing completely. And this isn't a completely recent phenomenon. Back in 2013, there's an article in The Spectator talking about the strange death of the middle class. And here's a really shocking one. A study by academics at Oxford University found that London had an 80% increase in poor households between 1980 and 2010. While the proportion of wealthy households also rose by 80%. So that's a really huge number over 30 years. You're thinking we're in a relatively prosperous period. 1980 onwards, an 80% increase in poor households and also an 80% increase in wealthy households, leaving the middle squeezed. And indeed, that same study found that 37% of households in London can now be described as middle income. 30 years ago, it was 65%. So that is a huge, huge shift. And that is really encapsulates exactly what we're talking about. If you imagine a spectrum divided crudely into three, previously most people were in the middle, 65% were in the middle. Now you've got most people at one extreme or the other and hardly anyone in the middle. So it's literally being squeezed out. So that's the evidence that what we're talking about is a real thing. But what are the causes behind it?
The first cause, and arguably the biggest, is our reliance on debt. Government debt and private debt. And the problem we have, if you look at our economy, is that growth is fueled by debt. We can't seem to achieve growth in our economy without using debt as a tool. So leading up to the last crisis, we were all encouraged as a nation to borrow, take money out, take loans out, spend it on different things, some of it being property, but other people spent it on holidays and whatever, and that caused a boom. But it also caused a crash. Now, after the crash, consumer debt levels have reduced slightly, which is good, and it needed to. But to pick up the slack, government debt levels have increased dramatically. So the government has had to take on huge amounts of debts to stimulate growth. Even though there's austerity measures going on, they needed to take out a lot of debt in the beginning to help move things forward. And that's the problem. We're always relying on debt. Now, you'll see in the future, consumer debt will start to rise again towards the second part of a cycle. This cycle will carry on, unless something very dramatic happens. But when you keep accumulating debt and you keep using debt to stimulate growth, it's going to result in a crash. We've had one before, we'll have one again. We don't learn our lessons, our economic memories seem to be very, very poor. And this is a real driver behind the disappearing middle classes, because the individual credit, the consumer credit, the way we live, the way society is today, is very damaging for the long term. Short term, lots of people have nice cars. They have lovely homes. They have wonderful clothes. And today, and the way the media is and the way our lifestyles are, we want everything today and we want the nice things now. But the problem is that people can't afford the nice things now, but they're playing keeping up with the Joneses. And you may say, oh, well, that's not me. But I think we all do it to a level, just some do it to more extreme levels. It's very hard to stand against society and say, you know what, everyone around me has fantastic cars, but I'm going to have one that's 15 years old. It's very hard to do. And that's the problem. Everybody's keeping up with everybody. The media tells us to buy new things and we take on debt. The problem is, a lot of people who take on this debt can't afford it and they're actually bankrupt. Let me explain. People who have very good jobs, let's say they are earning a great income, they're classed as middle class, upper middle class even. If they've got all this debt, they're relying on their job to fund it month in, month out. And from the outside in, they look wealthy. They look like they're doing very well because they've got all these lovely things, the nice home in the right area, the right car, the right schools, the right clothes. But if that person loses their job, 1 or 2 months later, they're in a lot of trouble. I've seen it happening, and I'm not going to go too specific in the details. It's somebody I know because they might listen to this. But I've seen it happen, and I've seen it happen on different levels more than once, where people have got very flashy lifestyles, but as soon as anything goes wrong with that regular income, they're in trouble. And this is not just a one-off. This is huge proportions of our society. And this is why people may be temporary middle class, but actually they're going to disappear into what's considered working class or lower incomes or lower wealth because of this massive problem. And this also links to the housing crisis, which we talked about last week, where people are going to become landlords or renters. And this gap is being driven further by supply and demand. And it's wedging out further and further, and it's going to be the haves and the have-nots. And this is very much linked. All three, the debt, the government debt, the individual debt, how we use it, the instant gratification, and the housing crisis we talked about last week, all contribute to these things. Quite scary. Even though it's under the radar, it's happening. But Rob, are we doomed?
Well, according to the show notes in front of me, I've got some solutions, but I'm not that excited about most of them, or rather, I'm not that convinced that many of them will happen. So maybe we are doomed, but you can decide when we get to the end of this section. There's things that the state or society at large can do, and there's things that you can do. So we'll start with what the state could do. And, well, it relies on honesty and realism. So you can decide for yourself how likely that is to actually happen. One thing that it could do is end the addiction to cheap credit, because if people are addicted to cheap credit so they can convince themselves that everything's fine and they can have everything they want, then government is like that with quite a few extra zeros on the end. It's really damaging that kind of crises are never allowed to play out. Everything's just always propped up by the printing of more money, and everything's kicked a little bit further down the road. I'm reading a book at the moment which is arguing that there hasn't been any real growth in the economy for decades. What we've had instead is a growth in the financial economy. We've been creating lots of money. We've been creating sort of various derivatives of what's going on and generating wealth that way. But there's nothing backing it up. That's why the debt just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the debt is massive before you even consider the forward obligations, which aren't technically debt, such as pensions. We've talked about the pensions crisis before. It's scary enough before you remember all the billions that have been promised to people. Yeah, we better move on. Another thing that they could do is to stop propping up house prices for political reasons. We'll be talking about house prices more next week. But we've seen it very recently. We saw house prices really being pumped up before the last general election to make everyone feel rich and make them feel like they're middle class and they're wealthy and everything's fine, when really it shouldn't have been that way at all. And this is damaging for the exact reasons that Rob talked about, where you're really kind of separating people out into haves and have-nots based on whether they can afford to buy or not. People who've already bought and they're seeing the value of their assets supposedly being inflated means they can borrow against that and buy more assets or move up. Whereas people who haven't got started yet or haven't got any inherited wealth are pretty much stuck. And that's why there's a lot of anger around this, and there's going to be more. And then just also setting expectations around what people's living standards are going to be like and what they can expect in pensions. If people assume that the pension's going to be there for them, then they're going to not necessarily take the actions that they should be. And then they're going to be shocked when they get to the end and realize there really isn't going to be anything. So that's what the state could do on a general level. Specifically, we've talked about house building a few times, and they could do something to solve this challenge, but they need to do something big. Really, every government comes in, they've got their own kind of proposals for what they're going to do, how they're going to hit a target, and they'll come in and say, oh, we're going to build 250,000 homes, and then inevitably they don't. But really, none of it is going to make the slightest bit of difference unless something really, really big happens, unless there's a genuine political will to do something about it. Serious reforms are needed, whether that's to do with investment or planning or whatever it is. It needs to be big. Otherwise, you're really just kind of fiddling around the edges. And I think social housing is a big part of this as well, because people get very angry that private landlords are receiving huge amounts of housing benefit in order to house people who need somewhere to live, because there isn't a lot of social housing. The reason why that is happening is because, well, to a private landlord, if they're going to take a social tenant, they need to be paid the market rent. They need to be paid the equivalent by the government as they would get if they rented to someone privately. There's nothing, I don't think the landlord there is doing anything wrong. That's just the market. If you don't want that to happen, you need to build a whole lot of social housing. So I think really this comes down to getting a grip of the whole thing and acknowledging what's going on. The government needs to decide if it's going to be in the business of providing housing or not. If it is, it needs to do it properly. If it's not, it needs to find other solutions. This is all just to do with the scale of the problem and admitting that it's a problem. And I think this is what links together the government part and the personal part. It's being realistic and admitting where we are and what we need to do. And until the government does that, nothing is going to change in the way it needs to. But the same is true for individuals. If you don't take personal responsibility, if you just keep keeping up with the Joneses, then you're going to get stuck in exactly the same position as everyone else. And it means that when things can't be propped up anymore and everything comes crashing down, you are going to be one of the people who gets squeezed out of the middle and drops right back down. And Rob gave a very good illustration of the precarious position that most people are in because of the debt that they've loaded themselves up with. Just as the country loads itself up with debt, it doesn't take much for their living standards to be seriously, seriously affected. So that section was meant to be about solutions, but I think I've just been even more gloomy, and that didn't really feel like I was solving a lot. So maybe we should forget all the gloomy, big kind of macro stuff that you can't really control and talk about what you can do.
Yeah, Rob, I'm not convinced either. I'm certainly not going to rely on the state or the house builders to sort this out, or the planning laws. So what does this mean for you? Well, listening to this podcast is a start. Understand what's happening. Educate yourself. If you understand what's going on and understand this crisis, then at least you can take action. And if you don't, you've only got yourself to blame. There you go, I said it. You can watch it happen, or you can take action. Because unfortunately, I don't think this is going to solve itself. I think the wedge and the gap is going to become even more exaggerated over the years to come. It could lead to scarier things like social unrest in the future. Who knows? We could see a Hunger Games style society. Hopefully not. But the point is, don't blindly follow others. Just because others are buying nice cars, buying nice things and not investing, don't necessarily do that yourself just because everyone else is. Look at what truly financially successful people are doing and copy and follow them. If they are investing in assets and becoming gradually more wealthy over time, they may not be flashy about it. They may not look like the wealthiest from the outside in, but actually build your network, go to meetups, find out people who are doing things more exciting. They might not know about this and they might just be doing it by default, and they know it on a subconscious level, but they might not actively call it a crisis. But they are moving themselves away from that middle. People are also moving themselves away from the middle the wrong way. But don't assume that it's going to be all right, that you'll be fine in the future. There'll be a pension for you. It's not going to happen. Listen to the pension crisis episode. It's not. I'll give you a warning. It's gloomy. It's as gloomy as this one. It's not fair. It's not right. I don't agree with this crisis, even though I understand it and can take advantage of it and go the right way. My personal needs are nowhere near as good, are nowhere near as important as society's needs. But the reason why we put this podcast out here, and the reason why we're talking about it, is so more people can find out about it, more people can understand what's happening, and make a decision, make a choice. It's scary stuff, but at least if you understand, you can take advantage of the crisis rather than be punished by it.
Okay, so to summarise, not one of our cheerier episodes. Living standards are falling for millions of people while the richest are getting much richer. And that is what we mean when we're talking about the middle class crisis. You're going to get forced one way or another. The system is set up in that way. It's not fair, like Rob just said, but it's reality, and it's up to you what you do with it. So why are we talking about this on the property podcast? Well, partially just because I think we're all using property for the most part to try and achieve the same goal. Most people in property, they like property, but the real reason that they're doing it is to give themselves a better future, to give themselves more freedom, to give themselves more control. So this topic is absolutely related to that. And then housing also is a huge contributing factor to the crisis, and something big needs to change. We're going to link to the pension crisis episode. If you haven't listened to that, then do. Maybe not right now. Doing this as a double bill might not work out so well, but do listen to that at some point.
You won't get out of bed.
Yeah, and it ties in exactly. I mean, just if you think the pension crisis is bad now, how much worse is it going to be when Generation Rent gets to retirement age and still has rent to pay, rather than having a place with a mortgage paid off, like a lot of people do at the moment? Doesn't bear thinking about. The key, though, is to make the right decisions now so you end up getting pushed the right way. If the middle class is getting squeezed, you want to make sure that you escape in the right direction and not the wrong one.
Wow. Okay. An important episode. A gloomy one, but an important one. Share this one, please, like the pension crisis one. There's some podcasts that we do that I feel are just really important for people to know and understand and hear about. And you know what? If you share it with people you care about or colleagues, you've done your bit. Whether they take action on it, it's up to them. But by letting people know about this, by giving them understanding of what's happening, they can take action. Now, we've got a brilliant resource, one of the strongest we've had for a few weeks coming up, and we'll let you know about next week's topic. But before that, we've got to get cheery again, Rob. So a round of applause, please, to this wonderful person who's left us a 5-star review. And it's Lee Gallimore, and Lee says, 5 stars. These podcasts have been brilliant. So much so, I've decided to book a meeting with Gavin at RMP Property. Thanks, guys. And that was actually done back in January, and I know Lee has worked with RMP since, and Yellow Lettings. And actually, Rob, we probably need to do a bit better of explaining who RMP are and Yellow Lettings, because when we went to the Property Investor Show, hardly anybody knew who they were or what they did. So we need to get a bit better at our marketing.
Yes, we do. But thank you very much, Lee. Thank you to everyone who has left us a review. If you haven't left us a review yet, then do it. Can't promise it's going to sort out your personal finances or the economy at large, but it'll make us feel good. And that's got to count for something, right? So go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast and you can leave us a review if you wish. But resource of the week, you've quite rightly trailed it as a really strong one, Rob. This is one that you found, so I'll leave you to explain it.
Okay, so this resource is really, really powerful tool, and you can use this as a predictor and a way of investing in the future. What is it? Well, it's a housing affordability map. So we'll link to it in the show notes because the URL is unreadable. It's huge. But what it does is it gives you a map of the UK, and it shows you over the last few years the affordability levels of property against household income. So the ratios start from 0 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 8, 8 to 10, 10 upwards. And it's interesting to see how hotspots in the past few years have previously been affordable and now are classed, the ratios have moved up and now are not as attractive. But interestingly, there are plenty of areas with lots of value. Some of the stronger areas, I mean, there's loads, so I definitely check out this tool. And it's funny, I said to the team when I showed them this earlier this week, it's like my secret sauce, because all the areas that have showing value are the areas that I'm focusing on now. But Derby is looking strong in terms of affordability. You've got Merseyside, so Wirral, Liverpool. Manchester's still looking good in parts. Leeds, surprisingly, a lot of affordability there. Hull, no surprise, we talked about Hull before. But further south, Midlands, Leicester, Peterborough, still value in those areas. And then moving even further south, there's definitely affordability in Swindon. Now, that doesn't mean you should pile into these areas. You need to know more than that. But they're a good indicator of where value is and where there's deals still to be done. And also the darker regions, they're just like, whoa, stay away. And as you can imagine, it's the majority of the southeast. Although previously, in 2013, if you go back, there's still a few areas in and around the southeast that offered value. Luton and Stevenage, for example. They've now moved on, and property prices in the last 2 years have pushed on. So it just shows you there's almost a ripple effect as you flick through the years of where the value is and where it's left.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at. It's quite addictive, actually. So I'll try and drag myself away and get back to the podcast, but it is well worth a look. Do go and check it out. Interestingly, for affordability, they're looking at a particular measure of affordability, but housing affordability can be thought about in several different ways, and we're going to have a feature about that in the next magazine to dig into that, because when someone says affordability, it's like, well, what does that really mean? Everyone's got their own kind of ideas based on incomes or proportion of income as mortgage payments and all that kind of thing. So we're going to be getting into that in the magazine, but do go and have a look. It's really interesting. There's no major shocks in there. I don't feel like we've been missing any tricks when we've been talking about this for the last couple of years, but just seeing it all mapped out and see how it's changed over the last couple of years is fascinating stuff.
And very much linked to next week's topic as well, because we're going to be looking next week at, will property double in the next 10 years? Well, I can give you some answers now. Yes, in certain areas, and no in others. But we're going to go into much more detail. We're going to look at cycles, what causes it, the averages, do they hold true? We're going to deep dive on a subject we've looked at before, which is average house prices and how long they take to double. But we're going to answer the question, will property double in the next 10 years? So many opinions around this, but hopefully we can cut to the chase and get fairly accurate on our predictions. I'm pretty confident we can get there, Rob, with the answer.
I think we can. It's a really interesting topic because, on the one hand, people say, look at the evidence. Housing doubles every 10 years. We're saying we're just kind of getting into the second part of the cycle soon where growth is even more aggressive. But then you look at affordability and go, well, how is that so when so much of the country is already unaffordable? Those points are not as contradictory as they first sound. There's loads and loads to it. We'll try and distill it down into a relatively brief and easy to understand and structured episode. It's going to be a good one, so make sure you're listening. Also, make sure that you get out tonight to a meetup. It's not too late if you're listening to this on the day it comes out. thepropertyhub.net/meetups is the place to go. We'd love to see you at one of them. But that is us done for today. Hope we haven't spoiled your day too much with our gloominess, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.